There is a particular quality to the silence over a dead world. I have stood at the edge of 3 of them now. Mirel's Reach, the shoal at Heron's Drift, and finally this one, the one they tell you nothing can prepare you for. And each time the silence is different. Mirel's Reach had a wind. A thin, high whistling across oxidized basalt, where there used to be a city of 340,000 people, a wind that moved through the ruins with an almost deliberate patience, as if it were searching for something it already knew it would not find. Heron's Drift had no wind at all, just the cold and the smell of charred ferrocrete that the cold had not fully killed after 19 years, and the way the light fell on the shattered grid of streets at a low angle, amber and attenuated, illuminating nothing but geometry. The outlines of what had been a transit station, the outlines of what had been a school. This one has neither wind nor cold nor the smell of anything. This one has only light, and the light is wrong. I have been standing here for 11 minutes by my suit's internal clock, and I have not moved, and my assessment team lead, Corporal Weiss, has not asked me to move. She is standing 20 meters to my left, and I can see by the cant of her helmet that she is looking at the same thing I am looking at, the horizon. The clean, unobstructed arc of a horizon that should not be clean and should not be unobstructed, because this is the place where a city of 6 million people used to be, and instead there is a flat plane of fused glass and compressed silicate that the impact had rendered down to something with the approximate smoothness of a factory floor, and stretching from that plane to the edge of what used to be an ocean basin and is now a shallow depression filled with a sky blue mineral slurry. There is nothing that was made by human hands, nothing that was placed here, nothing that rose or was built or was planted or was lived in. 19 years ago, a kinetic impactor traveling at 14% of the speed of light struck this continent at an angle of 17 degrees from the vertical, and in approximately 11 seconds, the city was not a city anymore. There were 31 of those impactors assigned to this world alone. 19 years ago, I was 23 years old, and I was a corporal first class assigned to the Outer Perimeter Survey Station at Callaway's Rest, which was not on any of the 31 inhabited worlds in humanity's volume of space at the time, and was therefore not on the Thelori Hegemony's target list. I know this because I am alive, and because every person who was on one of those 31 worlds is not. Let me be precise about that, because precision matters here, and I have given considerable thought over 19 years of whether precision is a kindness or a cruelty. And I have concluded that precision is the only thing left that can be given to the dead, which is nothing, but which is at least accurate. 9,344,812,007 people. That is the number the Remnant Worlds Assembly's Documentation Commission arrived at after 4 years of work, cross-referencing colonial census data, outer perimeter survey records, transit manifests, medical registries, and the fragments of communication logs that survived because they were cached on relay stations outside the strike window. The Commission's margin of error was plus or minus approximately 800,000. The Commission's chair, a woman named Adril Koska, who had been the survey administrator for the Saran colonies, and who had lost her entire family, and therefore had a particular relationship with the question of precision, insisted on including that margin of error in the final figure rather than rounding it. She said, "We do not round the dead. I was present for that. It was the 4th year of the rebuild, and I was sitting in a folding chair in a prefabricated meeting hall on the surface of Callaway's Rest, which had become in the years since the convergence strike the de facto administrative capital of what remained of humanity, not because it was particularly suitable for the role, but because it was there and it was intact. The hall smelled of recycled air and the particular institutional cleanliness of spaces that are being worked in around the clock by people who do not have time to let them get dirty. Adrel Koska was at the front. She was 61 years old, and she had the manner of a woman who had made some fundamental and permanent decision about herself and had not looked back. She said we do not round the dead. She said the margin of error represents somewhere between 0 and 1.6 million additional people. And we do not have the evidence to bring them into the number with certainty, and we do not have the right to exclude them from the number with convenience. So we name the number we can name, and we state the uncertainty clearly, and we let both of those things stand together. I wrote it down. I have it in my field log, which I have carried through 4 survey deployments in 19 years. We do not round the dead. The figure I now know, standing on the surface of this world in the 43rd day of operations, is this: of the 9,344,812,007 people who were alive on the morning of the Convergence strike, approximately 41 million survived. They survived because they were on vessels in transit between systems, or on outer ring survey stations like Callaway's Rest, or on 2 colony platforms that had been in the process of decommissioning, and were therefore not in any census that the hegemony's targeting data had been built from. They survived because they were, by the accounting of the Thelori Hegemony, already categorized as not worth the cost of a second strike package. The hegemony's targeting data missed 14 worlds entirely, and those 14 worlds are why I am here. I need to explain what I know about the hegemony's decision-making, because the story does not make sense without it, and because I spent 3 years as a ground assessment liaison officer attached to the remnant. Worlds Assembly Intelligence Directorate and I am therefore in possession of facts that most people who were present for the 44 days do not have, and this is the only time I expect to write any of it down. The Thelori Hegemony was not an empire in any sense that a human being would recognize. It was not a political structure with factions and leaders and interests that could be negotiated with or divided or pressured. It was something closer to a consensus mechanism, a distributed decision-making architecture that had evolved over roughly 40,000 years from what had once been a collection of biologically distinct species and had become, through a process of technological and cultural convergence that the hegemony itself referred to as the alignment, something that operated with a single goal structure and a single analytical framework. The hegemony's goal was resource optimization across its territorial volume over a planning horizon measured in geological time. The hegemony's analytical framework evaluated all factors, including the presence of other species, in terms of their compatibility with that goal. Humanity's expansion trajectory, as of approximately 30 years before the Convergence strike, had crossed a threshold that the hegemony's models identified as incompatible with the hegemony's resource projections at the 400-year mark. The hegemony had been monitoring us for approximately 800 years. It had conducted what amounted to a comprehensive survey of our military capability, our infrastructure, our population distribution, and our response time. It had concluded with what the Intelligence Directorate's analysts later assessed as a reasonable degree of accuracy given what it knew, that a simultaneous strike on all inhabited human systems would eliminate our capacity for organized resistance before we could mobilize any meaningful counterforce. It had then launched 4,100 relativistic impactors from a staging volume beyond our sensor range, and it had timed their arrival to a 180-second window. That is all. There was no declaration. There was no ultimatum. There was no communication of any kind. The hegemony's models indicated that negotiation was not a more efficient path to the 400-year resource projection than elimination, and the hegemony did not do things that its models indicated were less efficient than alternatives. That is the entirety of the reasoning. The Intelligence Directorate recovered it from a hegemony data archive on the 3rd day of operations, and I read the translation in a field tent on Thelori Prime's 3rd continent, while the Extinction Det formation's carrier battle groups were dismantling the orbital defense network above us. I remember the moment clearly. I remember the quality of the light through the tent fabric and the sound of the formation's strike elements at high altitude, and the particular texture of the translated document, which was not a document in the human sense, but a kind of compressed decision record, a notation of inputs and outputs with no emotional content whatsoever, the way a machine might log a subroutine completing. I remember that the analyst who had handed me the translation, a sergeant named Orrin Peller, stood at my shoulder while I read it, and when I finished reading it, he said nothing. He waited for me to speak. I did not speak for some time. Then I said, "They didn't explain themselves at all, did they?" And he said, "No, sir. There was nothing to explain. It was a logistical decision. I have thought about that for a long time. I think about it now, standing on the surface of this world with the flat plane of fused glass extending to the horizon and the shallow depression of the former ocean basin glinting pale blue at the edge of vision. I think about the particular nature of the offense, not its scale, which is immense, but its texture. They did not hate us. They did not fear us. They did not want our territory or our resources or our submission. They wanted us not to be here in 400 years. And the most efficient path to that outcome was to ensure we were not here in 3 minutes. The 3 minutes were not cruelty. The 3 minutes were convenience. We have spent 19 years and 44 days responding to that. In the first years after the convergence strike, the question that occupied the remnant world's assembly most urgently was not revenge. Revenge was not a concept that most of the survivors had the cognitive bandwidth to hold during the first years. The question that occupied us was survival. 41 million people across 14 marginal worlds, with infrastructure designed for a population orders of magnitude larger, with supply chains that had been shattered, along with everything that had produced and moved their components, with a political and administrative apparatus that had existed on the 31 dead worlds, and now did not exist at all. The first assembly convened on Callaway's Rest 11 days after the convergence strike. I attended it. I was a corporal at the time, and I had no business attending it, except that I had the only functioning large-format communications array on the Ghoul station, and I had spent the 11 days since the strike in the communications room, maintaining contact with the other survivor worlds, which meant I had information that most of the people in the room did not have. And information was what the assembly needed more than anything else. Those 11 days were the worst of my life. I want to say that once, plainly, and then I am not going to say it again. The communications logs from those 11 days are in the assembly's archive, and the archive contains everything they contain, and I do not need to add to them here. What I will say is that maintaining contact across 14 survivor worlds in the immediate aftermath of the strike required a particular kind of discipline that I had not known I had before I needed it. Every incoming signal carried specific information about a specific world's specific catastrophe, and every outgoing signal required a clarity and a calm that the specific information made difficult to maintain. And the only way to get through it was to treat each signal as a technical task, requiring a technical response, and to defer every other process until a later time that I understood might never come. The later time came. That is how I know what I know about the first 11 days, because I eventually had time to look at what I had written down while I was doing it, and to understand what I had been looking at. The first 3 days of the first assembly were, in the main, controlled. I say controlled, and I mean that by the 3rd day, the people in that room had stopped crying, not because they had processed their grief. That would have taken years, and in many cases, it never happened in the traditional sense, but because they had arrived at something harder than grief and more useful. They had arrived at the question of what to do. The assembly voted on the 14th day to establish the Remnant World's Reconstruction Authority. The authority's mandate was threefold. First, to stabilize the survivor populations on the 14 remaining worlds. Second, to conduct a comprehensive assessment of remaining industrial and military capacity. Third, to develop a response to the Thelori Hegemony. The third mandate was added by amendment, proposed by a former fleet admiral named Rhine Sohar, who had survived the convergence strike because she had been in transit between her flagship and a repair facility in the Outer Ring, and whose flagship had been among the 31 warships that had been present in the inhabited systems, and had been destroyed by the same impactors that had destroyed the worlds they orbited. She proposed the amendment in 3 sentences. She said, "We know who did this. We know where they are. We should make it clear, in writing, and as an official mandate of this assembly, that a response will be made. And then we should build the response." The amendment passed with no dissenting votes, no votes at all against. I was in the room when Sohar spoke. She was 48 years old. She was wearing a survival suit that had not been changed in 11 days. And her hair was cut short in the way of people who work in environments where longer hair is a hazard. And she stood at the center of the assembly floor with her hands at her sides and her voice perfectly level. She did not raise it. She did not rush it. She gave the amendment 3 sentences, and then she sat down and looked at the floor and waited for the vote. Afterward, in the corridor, I passed close enough to her to hear her talking to a Reconstruction Authority staffer who was asking about the feasibility of some industrial assessment procedure. She answered the question precisely and then moved on. I do not think she had slept in 11 days. I do not think she was going to sleep for some time. What followed was 19 years of construction. I was not a ground assessment officer during most of those years. For the first 6, I was a survey technician on the rebuild crews, which is what the Reconstruction Authority called the teams that spent those years stripping salvageable material from the Outer Ring stations and transit platforms and defunct orbital facilities and feeding it into the fabrication lines that the 14 surviving worlds were building as fast as their reduced industrial capacity allowed. We built the fabrication lines first. Then we used the fabrication lines to build more fabrication lines. Then we used all of them to build warships. I have heard people describe the shipbuilding program in terms of discipline and collective will, and the transformation of grief into purpose. And all of that is true as far as it goes. But what I remember about those years is something simpler and more physical. I remember the sound of fabrication plants running continuously, day and night for years. The particular bass vibration that you felt in the deck plating of any structure near an active heavy fabrication facility, the way it settled into your teeth after a few months, and then became part of the background of existence. I remember the smell of hot metal and cut composite, and the particular bite of machining coolant in the air of the fabrication bays. I remember the quality of the light in those spaces, very bright, very even. The kind of lighting that is designed to eliminate shadows in a production environment, so that nothing is hidden and no defect is missed. I remember that everyone worked, not because they were compelled to, and not because they had been organized by some sophisticated motivational architecture. They worked because the work was the only available way to hold the weight of what had happened without being destroyed by it. The dead could not be unkilled. The worlds could not be rebuilt in any rapid sense. The 3 minutes could not be unmade. But the Thelori Hegemony could be made to understand what 3 minutes costs, and the only path that was through the fabrication plants. And so the fabrication plants ran. In year 7, I transferred to the Ground Assessment Corps, which was a division of the Reconstruction Authority's military arm that had been established to train the personnel who would accompany the warship formation when it eventually launched. The Ground Assessment Corps mission was to document, to enter hegemony worlds after the orbital and surface military phases and conduct the assessments that the Documentation Commission would use to build the operational record. We were not combatants in the primary sense. We were record keepers who were trained to operate in environments that had recently been conflict zones. There was debate about whether the accounting elements were necessary at all. I sat in on 2 of those debates because by year 7, I had enough seniority in the Reconstruction Authority's military arm to be invited into rooms where policy was being argued. The position against the accounting elements was straightforward. The formation's mission was to address the hegemony's military and industrial. infrastructure, and that mission did not require ground presence beyond what the strike elements themselves required. Documentation could be accomplished from orbital survey platforms. The accounting elements were an additional resource cost in an environment where resources were not abundant. The position for the accounting elements was Adrel Koska's position, and she made it in writing, in a memorandum to the authority's military directorate in 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said, "The Documentation Commission was established to build the permanent record of what the Thelori Hegemony did, and what we did in response, and a permanent record assembled without ground-level assessment is not a permanent record. It is a collection of orbital photographs and sensor logs that future generations will rightly question for completeness." The second paragraph said, "We brought people to these worlds to live and work and raise families and grow old, and the least we can do for the dead is stand on the ground where they died and look at it directly and write down what we saw. That is what the accounting elements are for." The accounting elements were approved. 44 teams, 112 personnel. The training was thorough and it took 2 years. And when it was finished, I was a lieutenant assigned to the nascent accounting element structure that would eventually become the 44 teams that deployed with the Extinction debt formation. My team lead was a corporal named Weiss, who had been 9 years old on the morning of the Convergent strike and had been on an educational transit vessel between Callaway's Rest and an outer ring science platform, which is how she was alive. She was 28 years old when we trained together, and she had a quality that I think of as calibrated steadiness, not the absence of feeling, but the complete and permanent decision not to allow feeling to interrupt function. I understood it because I had practiced a version of it myself in the communications room during the 11 days after the strike, and I recognized it in her as the same thing that had allowed me to keep sending signals when the signals were telling me things that no person should be asked to process without pausing. The training included what the Corps called contextual conditioning, which was the deliberate exposure of personnel to detailed documentation of the Convergence strike. The casualty records, the impact assessment data, the communication logs, the survivor testimony. Under conditions designed to be professionally analytical rather than emotionally processing, the intent was not to make us numb to what had happened, but to make us capable of functioning in proximity to evidence of it without that functioning being interrupted. There is a difference, and the Corps understood the difference, and the training was designed around it. Whether any given person came out of the training having achieved the intended result was a question that could only be answered by deploying the person. Mira Ellen completed the training successfully. So did everyone else in Accounting Element 3. 13 years into the rebuild, the Reconstruction Authority renamed itself the Remnant Worlds Assembly and formally constituted the Extinction Debt Formation as the military arm of the response. The name was proposed by Adrel Koska, who had by then been serving as the Assembly's chief documentation officer for 9 years, and who was 73 years old, and had spent those 9 years compiling the most comprehensive casualty record in the history of any documented atrocity, a record that by the time operations began ran to more than 400 volumes. She proposed the name in writing, in a formal memorandum to the Assembly, and her reasoning was as follows. The Thelori Hegemony made a calculation. It calculated that our extinction was worth 3 minutes of ordnance. We are going to return that calculation. The debt owed is not vengeance, which is emotional and therefore imprecise. The debt owed is accounting. They purchased an outcome. We are going to deliver the invoice. The Extinction Debt Formation launched on the 19th anniversary of the Convergence strike. 1,147 warships. Every vessel that the 14 worlds and their fabrication programs had produced over 19 years, minus the maintenance reserve, minus the garrison hulls, minus the 6 hospital ships that the Assembly had voted to retain in the survivor volume, regardless of the operational tempo, 7 carrier battle groups, 4 independent strike lines, the Reckoning Screen, which was the designation for the 112 fast patrol vessels assigned to picket duty and signal interdiction across the Hegemony's outer sensor architecture. The Accounting Elements, which was the designation for the 44 ground assessment teams that would follow the strike lines onto the surfaces of every Hegemony world once the orbital defense architecture had been cleared. I was assigned to Accounting Element 7, attached to the 4th strike line. The 4th strike line's first target was Thelori Prime. I am not going to describe the first 3 days of operations at Thelori Prime at length, because what happened there is already on the record in the Assembly's operational archive, and because I was not involved in the orbital phase, which is what the first 3 days were. What I can tell you is what it looked like from the surface on the 4th day, when Accounting Element 7 was set down on the 3rd continent to begin the ground assessment phase. The orbital defense network had been cleared. The space-based logistics infrastructure, the stations, the depot platforms, the fabrication nodes that had produced and maintained the Hegemony's military capacity had been struck. The surface military installations had been struck according to the targeting package that the Intelligence Directorate had developed over 14 years of sensor observation from the Hegemony's periphery. The Planetary Administration Complex had been struck on day 2. The Hegemony's distributed decision-making architecture had no analog to a government in any human sense, but it had facilities that functioned as the physical substrate of its consensus mechanism. Data centers, communication nodes, processing arrays, and those had been struck according to priority sequence beginning on day 1. What I found on the 3rd continent, on the 4th day, was not a battlefield in any sense I had been trained for. There was no ongoing combat. There were no defensive positions. There was no organized resistance of any kind, because the Hegemony's architecture did not function in a way that produced organized resistance in the traditional military sense. The Hegemony's distributed nature meant that what humans would call command and control was embedded in the physical infrastructure that the formation had been striking. And with that infrastructure gone, what remained was not a force in retreat, but a biological population without a directing architecture, like a body whose nervous system has been removed. The Hegemony's biological units, the individual organisms that had made up its population, were present on the surface, but they were not doing anything in any coordinated sense. They were present the way bees are present when the hive structure has been destroyed. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the record requires precision and not editorial framing. The Accounting Elements documented what we found. What we found on Thelori Prime and on the subsequent Hegemony worlds was not a population engaged in surrender or resistance or any recognizable response to the presence of an invading force. The Hegemony's biological units were incapable of individual decision-making of the kind that would have allowed them to surrender or resist or respond, because individual decision-making was not how the Hegemony's architecture worked. The Hegemony decided collectively and executed individually, and with the collective mechanism gone, the individual execution simply ceased. The Documentation Commission's report on this aspect of the operations is precise and thorough, and I commend it to anyone who wants a full accounting. I walked through 4 of those dispersed settlement nodes on the 3rd continent over the course of 3 days with my assessment team. Wiz was with me and 4 other Marines and our documentation specialist, a former Survey Corps analyst named Tash Delian, who was from what had been the outer colonies of the Sarin system, and who had been 9 years old when the convergence strike had killed her family, which was not the sort of thing we discussed during operations, but which I knew and which informed, I think, the particular quality of the care she brought to her work. She documented everything. She was methodical about it, in the way that Adrel Koska had been methodical about the casualty records. And I think they shared the same understanding of what documentation was for, which was not to prove anything to anyone, but to make the permanent record as precise as possible, to refuse imprecision as a form of respect for the weight of what had been done and what was being done. She moved through each node with the survey array and the atmospheric package and her field recorder, and she logged everything in the sequence that the assessment core training specified. And she did not pause and she did not comment. And when she had finished, she filed her records and she prepared for the next node. I watched her do this on each of the 3 days, and I did not interfere with it because there was nothing to interfere with. She was doing her job correctly. We filed our ground assessment reports each evening. I filed 9 of them over the course of the 4th Strike Line's operations on Thelori Prime. The reports were transmitted to the formation's central archive, and from there to the Assembly's Documentation Authority, and they joined the operational record alongside the reports from the other 43 accounting elements across the other 16 hegemony systems. On day 12, the 4th Strike Line completed its operations at Thelori Prime and transited to the Thelori secondary system, which was a cluster of 3 industrial worlds, designated by the Hegemony as resource processing nodes, and which had produced, among other things, the fabrication capacity that had manufactured the 4,100 impactors used in the Convergence strike. I know this because the Intelligence Directorate had the archive data, and because I read the relevant entries in the field tent on day 3. The fabrication records were precise. The hegemony was precise about everything. The records indicated the manufacturing schedule, the targeting allocation, the launch sequence, and the projected impact times to a precision of approximately 4 seconds across a delivery window of 180 seconds. The precision was, in its way, the most informative thing in the archive. It told you more about the hegemony than any other single piece of documentation. They had not been careless. They had not been in a hurry. They had been meticulous in the way that a species that plans on a geological time horizon is meticulous about the things it considers worth being meticulous about. They had considered our elimination worth being meticulous about. On day 12, standing on the embarkation platform waiting for the shuttle that would carry Accounting Element 7 back to the carrier Grief of Callaway's Rest, I looked up at the sky above Thelori Prime's 3rd continent one last time. It was a white sky, high clouds, the quality of light that you get in the late morning on any world with a standard atmospheric profile. The light was clean and ordinary. There was nothing dramatic about it. It looked like a morning. I thought about that for a long time during the transit to the secondary system. I thought about the way the hegemony had made its decision. In their terms, what they had done to us was ordinary. It was a logistical decision logged in a record that had no more emotional weight than a maintenance notation. In their terms, what we were doing to them was a response to a logistical decision with a logistical response. The debt was being paid in the same currency in which it had been incurred. The secondary system took 8 days. The 3 industrial worlds had no population to speak of in the distributed sense. The hegemony's biological units operated those facilities on a rotation cycle, and the assault elements of the 4th Strike Line had cleared the defense architecture on the 1st day. And by the time Accounting Element 7 set down on the primary industrial world, there was very little left to assess beyond the structural confirmation of what the strike packages had targeted. I filed 4 reports. They were brief. The precision of the targeting had left nothing ambiguous. The Intelligence Directorate's assessment of those facilities had been accurate, and the formation's strike packages had addressed each target in the sequence, and to the specifications that the operational plan required. The fabrication nodes that had built the 4,100 impactors were no longer fabrication nodes. What remained was the outline of them, in the same way that a word remains as the shape of what was said after the sound has ended. I walked through one of the primary facilities with Weiss and Delian, and I noted its dimensions in my field log, and I described the structural status and the remaining materials and the evidence of the targeting, and I filed it as Report 14. Then I walked back to the shuttle, and we lifted. By day 23, The formation had completed its primary objectives at 11 of the 17 hegemony systems. The remaining 6 required additional operational days, because 2 of them had defense architectures more extensive than the Intelligence Directorate's preliminary surveys had indicated, and 3 of them had communication nodes buried at depths that required additional strike packages to reach. The formation adapted. The planning staff aboard the formation flagship, Perseverance of every name, had prepared contingency packages for exactly these scenarios, because the planning staff had spent 4 years developing the operational framework and had not assumed that the Intelligence Directorate's data would be complete. They had built in variance. They had built in time. They had built in the understanding that a 19-year preparation does not guarantee the absence of the unexpected, and that the response to the unexpected is not improvisation but the application of the contingency architecture that responsible planning always includes. I spent days 23 through 31 on the formation's carrier group during the transit and assault phases for Systems 8 through 14. The carrier was the Grief of Callaway's Rest, which had been named by the woman who had commanded the assembly's construction authority for the first 12 years and who had died of a respiratory illness in year 13, 2 years before the hull was completed. The naming was her daughter's idea. I had been briefly acquainted with the daughter, a navigation officer serving aboard one of the picket vessels of the Reckoning Screen, and she had cried when they painted the name on the hull, and she had not cried after that. I had been present for neither event. I know it from the record. On the carrier, during those transit days, there was a quality to the silences that I had not encountered since the early years at Callaway's Rest in the period immediately after the strike. It was not grief. Grief had been metabolized long ago into something else, into the formation and the 44 days. It was something closer to the particular clarity that comes at the end of a very long piece of work when the outcome is no longer in question and what remains is only the execution of the final steps. The outcome had been determined on the day of the first assembly when Ryan Sohar proposed the amendment in 3 sentences. Everything since then had been the execution. What people felt during those transit days was not relief, which implies a threat that has passed, and not triumph, which implies an emotional investment in the outcome beyond the outcome itself. What they felt, as nearly as I can describe it from the inside, was the recognition that the work was progressing correctly. People spoke in measured tones. They ate at scheduled intervals. They performed their duties with the same attention they had brought to every other day of the previous 19 years. In the hangar bays, the maintenance crews worked on the strike packages with the same calibrated care they had brought to the first day of operations. In the medical bay, the ship's surgeon processed the minor casualties from the previous assault phase and filed her reports to the formation's medical authority. In the communications room, the signals team maintained the encrypted links to the assembly's central archive and filed the daily operational updates that Adrel Koska's documentation authority required. Because the documentation authority's standing order was that every day of operations was to be recorded in full, regardless of whether anything of particular note had occurred, because the record was not only for occasions of note, but for the full accounting of what had been done and what it had cost, day by day and hour by hour. From the first moment of operations to the last, it costs something. I want to be clear about that because I have heard accounts of the 44 days that treat the formation's operations as something clean and simple, a settling of accounts accomplished without complication. And while the accounting was in fact precise in the ways that matter, the 44 days were not costless. 11 members of the Extinction debt formation were killed during the operations. 3 in an engagement with an unexpectedly intact defense installation on the 9th system, a buried facility that the Intelligence Directorate's survey data had classified as inactive, and which was not, and whose automated defense sequence engaged the leading elements of the 7th carrier. battle group's ground force before the error could be corrected. 4 in a structural collapse during a ground assessment on the 14th system, when a subsurface processing facility that had been assessed as cleared had a delayed detonation sequence in its power core that had not been identified in the pre-assessment sweep. 2 in a transit accident on day 36 that had nothing to do with the hegemony at all. A navigation failure during a complex maneuver in the approach to the 16th system that cost the picket vessel, Callaway's 8th, its helmsman and its senior communications officer. 1 from a medical event that had been present and undiagnosed before the operation began. And 1, I write this carefully and with the full weight it deserves, from a deliberate act of her own choosing. A former Survey Corps analyst in Accounting Element 3 named Mira Ellen, who had spent 21 days walking the surfaces of hegemony worlds and filing her documentation reports with precision and care, and who on the 22nd day had decided, in whatever way such decisions are arrived at, that she had completed the purpose she had come to complete, and had acted on that decision before anyone in her team could reach her. She was 44 years old. She had been 17 when the Convergence strike killed her family on the 4th colony of the Saran system. I did not know her personally. I know her from the record because Tashdelian knew her, and because Tashdelian made sure, in her documentation filings for the period covering day 22, that Mira Ellen's full name and her age, and the fact of her history and the fact of what she had done were recorded with the same precision and the same weight as everything else in the operational archive. We do not round the dead, not ours, not anyone's. 11. On day 37, the formation completed its operations at the 16th hegemony system and transited to the 17th, which was the outermost, the farthest from Thelori Prime, a cold world at the outer edge of the hegemony's territorial volume that it had served as a deep space sensor network. Hub, the facility, the intelligence directorate believed, from which the hegemony's 800-year monitoring of human space had been conducted, or at least coordinated. It was a small objective in operational terms. The 7th Carrier Battle Group's leading elements cleared the defense architecture in a matter of hours on the morning of day 38. The accounting elements did not deploy to the surface. The Intelligence Directorate's team went down and retrieved the archive data that was their mission objective, and the strike packages addressed the facility's physical infrastructure, and that was the 17th system. On the afternoon of day 38, Fleet Admiral Sohar convened a command review aboard the formation flagship, Perseverance of Every Name. I was not in the room. I was aboard the Grief of Callaway's Rest. The transcript was distributed to all senior accounting element personnel within 24 hours, and I read it in my bunk with the carrier's drives at standard transit power and the bass vibration in the deck plating at its resting note, the note I had lived with for 44 days. Admiral Sohar said the following in the transcript's record: "The operational objectives have been met. All 17 hegemony systems have been addressed in accordance with the operational plan and its contingency provisions. The military architecture has been dismantled. The industrial infrastructure has been dismantled. The administrative and communications infrastructure has been dismantled. The intelligence archive has been secured. What existed before does not exist now and will not exist again in any form that represents a threat or a continuation. The Assembly's mandate has been executed." She paused. There is a notation in the transcript indicating a pause of approximately 11 seconds. Then she said, "We are going to make one additional transit. We are going to return to the first world. Not because there is anything remaining to be done there that has not been done, but because the Documentation Commission's mandate, which is the Assembly's mandate, and which is the reason this formation has accounting elements rather than simply strike elements, is the full accounting. And the full accounting includes standing on the ground of the principal world of this conflict and stating for the permanent, record what was done there and what was done in response and what stands now," she said. I want an accounting element on that surface. I want the record complete. The grief of Callaway's Rest arrived at the outer orbit of the first world on day 42. Accounting element 7 was assigned the surface deployment. The shuttle descent was logged at 06:34 hours on day 43. I have been standing here now for what my suit's clock tells me is 31 minutes. The flat plane of fused glass extends from the edge of the landing site to the horizon, which is 12 kilometers in this thin atmosphere. The former ocean basin to the south catches the orange-white light of the wrong-colored sun and returns it as a faint pale glint. Wids has moved from her position to my left. She is standing approximately 40 meters away, closer to the edge of what was the city's administrative grid, and she is looking at something on the ground. I cannot see what it is from here. Delian is to my right with her equipment array deployed, working methodically through her documentation sequence with the same care she has brought to every surface on every hegemony world for the past 43 days. I open my field log. It is a physical log. I have carried it in hard copy because the Assessment Corps training specifies a redundant documentation protocol, and hard copy is one of the redundant systems in case the electronic records are lost or corrupted. The log has the weight of 19 years in my hands. The cover is scuffed and the spine is cracked, and the first pages are stiff with age. The first entry is from the morning of the convergence strike, a routine survey notation in my handwriting at 23, a tighter and more careful hand than I have now. The notation records the beginning of a shift at the Callaway's Rest communications array. Atmospheric readings within normal parameters. No signals of note in the outer perimeter band. Scheduled maintenance on Relay Cluster 7. The last entry before today is from day 41, a transit notation. The carrier was in transit between the 16th and 17th systems. I noted the departure time and the estimated transit duration, and the operational phase designation. Nothing else. I write today's entry in the space below it. I write the date. I write the coordinates of the landing site. I write the assessment team designation and the formation day. Then I write what I came to write. This is the surface of the world that the Thelori Hegemony designated as Target 3 in its convergence strike package. The world that the Hegemony S-planning documents identify by a numeric coordinate and a resource classification code. The world that held the largest single human population of any world in the inhabited volume on the morning of the strike. 2,417,000,000 people, alive and working and eating and sleeping and whatever else people do on an ordinary morning, and then in the time it takes to cross a room, not alive. This is also the world to which the Extinction debt formation has returned on day 40. 3 of operations, having completed its 44-day accounting across all 17 Thelori Hegemony systems, to stand on the surface and state for the permanent record what was done here and what has been done in response. The Thelori Hegemony conducted the convergence strike on the date recorded in the Assembly's central archive. The Hegemony's reasoning, as recovered from its data archives on the 3rd day of operations, was that humanity's expansion trajectory was incompatible with the Hegemony's resource projections at the 400-year mark. The Hegemony calculated that the cost of eliminating the incompatibility was approximately 4,100 relativistic impactors delivered in a 180-second window. The Hegemony calculated that this was the most efficient path to its projected outcome. The Hegemony logged its decision in the same record format it used for any other logistical decision. 9,344,812,007 people. The Extinction debt formation's response took 19 years to prepare and 44 days to deliver. 1,147 warships. All 17 Thelori Hegemony systems. All military, administrative, and industrial infrastructure across the entire Hegemony territorial volume. The Hegemony's sensor architecture. The Hegemony's fabrication nodes. The Hegemony's distributed processing network. The Hegemony's data archive, secured and transferred to the Assembly's Intelligence Directorate for the permanent record. All of it addressed according to the operational plan, within the planned timeline, with the contingency provisions applied as required. The 44 days were methodical. The 44 days were precise. They were in the hegemony's own terms. The terms of logistics and efficiency and resource calculation across a defined planning horizon, the exact equivalent of the 3 minutes returned in full, compounded by completeness. The hegemony calculated that humanity was incompatible with its 400-year future. The hegemony's calculation did not account for the 14 worlds its targeting data missed. The hegemony's calculations did not account for the 41 million people who survived because they occupied positions in the inhabited volume that were too marginal to appear in the data that the hegemony had used to build its strike package. The hegemony's calculation did not account for what those 41 million people would do with 19 years of grief that had hardened into something more durable than grief. The hegemony's calculation did not account for Ryan Sohar, who proposed the third mandate in 3 sentences on day 14 and then spent 19 years making it real. The hegemony's calculation did not account for Adrel Koska, who spent 9 years building the record of what was taken so that nothing would be rounded and nothing would be forgotten. The hegemony's calculation did not account for Tash Delian, who is standing 20 meters to my right on this surface at this moment, documenting this, the way she has documented everything for 43 days. The hegemony's calculation did not account for Mira Ellen, whose name is in the record. The hegemony's calculation did not account for the 11 members of this formation who are also in the record. The hegemony made a calculation. We returned it. I closed the field log. Whis is walking toward me from the administrative grid boundary. She does not speak immediately when she reaches me. She stands beside me for a moment and looks at the horizon, and then she looks at me. Her faceplate is slightly fogged at the lower edge from her breath, the way suit faceplates fog in cold atmospheres at low activity levels. I can see her face clearly enough. She looks the way she has looked for 43 days, which is the way she has looked for 19 years of knowing her, which is to say that whatever is inside her is arranged in a way that does not show on the outside except as a kind of settled attention. She says, "Are you finished, sir?" I say, "Yes," she says. "I'll call for extraction," I say. "Do that." She moves away toward the communications equipment on the edge of the landing site. I do not move yet. I stand on the glass plane for a few more minutes, and I look at the horizon, and I think about the quality of the silence here, which is different from the silence at Mirel's Reach, and different from the silence at Heron's Drift, and which I do not have a name for. It is not the silence of an ending, because an ending implies that something was concluded, and is now over in the way of things that conclude. What happened here concluded 19 years ago in approximately 11 seconds. What I am standing in is the silence of a complete accounting. The hegemony calculated a debt. The debt has been paid to the last decimal. The account is closed in the most absolute sense that anything can be closed. The silence is the silence of arithmetic after the final sum has been reached and confirmed, and the ledger has been put down. The extraction shuttle arrives with the sound of its engines high in the atmosphere before I can see it. I hear it descend, and I look up, and I watch it come through the high, thin clouds, and then through the lower air, and then settle onto the landing's find site with the low vibration of its drive system reducing to idle. The boarding ramp extends. Behind me, Delian is finishing her documentation sequence. She will pack her equipment in the precise order the core training specifies, and she will board the shuttle when she is ready and not before, because the record is not complete until it is complete, and she has never in 43 days treated the final steps of a documentation sequence as less important than the first ones. I wait for her. Wiz waits at the ramp. When Delian's equipment is packed and her files are uploaded and her field recorder is secured, she walks to the ramp and boards without looking back at the plane. I follow her. Wiz is the last. She boards and secures the hatch and speaks to the pilot on the intercom, and the shuttle lifts. Through the porthole beside my seat, I watched the surface of the world fall away. The flat glass plain, the pale glint of the former ocean basin, the wrong-colored sun still moving in its arc across the wrong-colored sky, the clean, unobstructed horizon. I watch it until the shuttle is in the upper atmosphere and the surface is lost in the haze of altitude. And then I watch the haze thin into the black of the outer orbital layer. And then there is only the carrier group ahead of us, the grief of Callaway's Rest and its escort vessels. The hull's sun glinted at this distance, holding position in the black. I open my field log. The last entry on the surface ends mid-page. I add 3 lines below it in the same careful hand. The formation's operations are complete. All 17 hegemony systems addressed. The debt has been paid to the full figure as documented by the Documentation Commission under the direction of Admiral Koska, Chief Documentation Officer of the Remnant Worlds Assembly. I close the log. The shuttle docks. The formation assembles for the transit back to the assembly volume. 1,136 warships, accounting for the losses and the maintenance reserve that remained in home space during operations. The transit takes 9 days. They are quiet days. I sleep, I eat. I write nothing in the field log because there is nothing to write that has not been written. On the 9th day, we enter the assembly volume, and through the carrier's forward viewport, I can see the 14 surviving worlds on the long range. Display, 14 points of light in the dark, the whole of what remains of us, the 41 million and their children, and the children of their children, the people born into a world that had already been broken before they arrived in it, and who have grown up knowing its shape with the matter-of-fact intimacy that people have for the shape of the world they are born into. The fabrication plants that ran for 19 years building warships have now been running for the entire duration of the operations building something else. Habitations, infrastructure, medical facilities, the slow and expensive reconstruction of what was lost. The rebuild is measured in generations. The people born on the 14 worlds since the convergence strike have already begun to accomplish things that their parents' generation did not have the time or the resources to accomplish. This is how it works. This is how it always works. Admiral Koska is 80 years old now. She is the oldest member of the Documentation Commission's active leadership, and she is still its chair, and she will be waiting in the Commission's facility on Callaway's Rest for the formation's operational archive, which will be delivered within 24 hours of our arrival. The Commission will spend years building the operational record into the same kind of comprehensive accounting that they built for the convergence strike. Every assessment report, every strike package log, every transit notation, every name from Ryan Sohar at the command review on day 38 to Mira Ellen on day 22. Every margin of error stated clearly, nothing rounded. The formation flagship perseverance of every name leads the approach vector into the assembly volume, and across the 14 points of light on the long-range display, I can see the traffic of recovery and reconstruction, the transport vessels moving between worlds, the supply convoys, the hospital ships that stayed home during the operations and are now returning to their standard rotation cycles, the orbital platforms of the emerging infrastructure, life, the particular messiness and density of life, visible even at this distance as the texture of signals on the communication spectrum. The Thelori Hegemony made a calculation about 400 years from now. The 41 million people on the 14 worlds, and their children, and the children of their children who will read Admiral Koska's record one day and know precisely what was done and what it cost and what it means. Those people will reach 400 years from now. They will be there. They will have rebuilt. They will have built beyond rebuilding into whatever comes after that, into whatever human civilization becomes when it has the time and the space and the resources to become it, which it now does. Because the factor in the hegemony's calculation that the calculation got wrong was not the 400-year resource projection, which may or may not have been accurate. The factor it got wrong was 41 million people, and 19 years and 147 warships more than it had. The debt owed is not vengeance. The debt owed is accounting. The account is closed. What stands now is the 14 worlds and the record, and the 41 million and the work they are doing, and whatever that work produces in 400 years, which the Thelori Hegemony will not be there to see, and which will therefore prove, as precisely as anything can be proved, that the hegemony's calculation was wrong in the only way that matters. The carrier decelerates on its final approach. The drives reduce to docking power. The vibration in the deck plating drops from the transit node to the quiet almost stillness of maneuver speed. And in the main compartment, the crew moves through the routine of arrival. Wiss is at the bulkhead across from me, with her harness secured and her hands in her lap, and she is looking at the viewport and the 14 points of light that are growing slowly on the approach vector, and her expression is the expression she always has, which tells you nothing and tells you everything. I hold my field log in my hands. It runs from a routine shift notation on the morning of the worst day in human history to the last entry on the surface of the dead world. That arc is complete. I am not going to add to it. The carrier docks. The ramp extends. The formation is home. The first thing I do when I am back aboard the station at Callaway's Rest, before I file my final operational report, and before I eat and before I sleep, is go to the Documentation Commission's facility and hand my field log to the archivist on duty. The archivist is a young man I do not know, new to the commission since the formation left, and he handles the log with the careful attention that commission personnel are trained to bring to primary source documents. He opens a protective sleeve for it. He photographs the cover and the spine before opening it. He photographs each page in sequence, beginning with the first entry from the morning of the convergence strike, and he will continue until he has photographed every entry. And the photographs will become part of the permanent archive alongside everything else. I watch him work for a few minutes. Then I tell him I will need the log returned when the photographing is finished, because it is mine and I intend to keep it. He nods. He notes my name and unit designation for the return log. He goes back to work. I walk out of the Documentation Commission's facility and I stand for a moment in the corridor, which is one of the original prefabricated corridors of the Callaway's Rest station, unchanged in the 19 years since the first assembly met here, and I look at the walls and the lights and the scuffed composite deck, and I think about the quality of the silence here, which is different from every other silence I have been in, because this silence is full of people. The station is busy at this hour with the activity of a place that has been the center of a 19-year project and is now integrating the return of the formation and processing the operational archive and doing approximately 1,000 other things simultaneously. I can hear voices from the administrative section and the vibration of the fabrication levels below, and somewhere a conversation in the corridor ahead of me that I cannot make out clearly. I stand in the corridor and I listen to it for a moment, the particular texture of a living place, people moving through it with purposes, sounds overlapping. Then I walk toward the residential section, and the corridor carries me there. And behind me, the Documentation Commission's facility is still working, as it has been working for 19 years and will be working for years more, building the record that Adrel Koska has spent her life building, the most precise and complete accounting of what was done to us and what we did in response, the record that will be read by the children of children in a future that the Thelori Hegemony's calculation said we would not have. The account is closed. The record will remain open as long as there are people to read it, which is to say, permanently.